He's 13.
First of all, I want to assign a copy to him.
Please do. Please
For
do.
me, this was...
What you're laying out here is exactly why this case has gotten so much attention. It's not just messy. It's layered, and every layer raises bigger questions than the last. At the center of it is Rebel Wilson and her film The Deb, which started as a creative project and has now spiraled into a full-scale legal and PR war. Her dispute with producer Amanda Ghost quickly escalated from behind-the-scenes disagreements into public accusations, lawsuits, and now claims of coordinated smear campaigns. Once it reached that point, it stopped being just a film industry conflict and turned into something much bigger about reputation, power, and credibility. The email from Brian Friedman you mentioned is a perfect example of how aggressive this has become, referencing allegations like sex trafficking in illegal disputes, especially tied to financial losses and settlement pressures, about as hardball as it gets. But even with language that's strong, the key issue remains the same. What can actually be proven? In court, claims like that can't rely on implication or association. They need concrete, verifiable evidence. Just being connected to powerful or controversial figures isn't enough on its own. That's where Len Blavatnik enters the picture. His name adds a whole different level of gravity because of his wealth and influence, but also because of past associations that people online are quick to connect to larger narratives. The challenge is separating what's suggestive from what's legally relevant. Courts don't operate on this. Seems suspicious. They require a clear chain of evidence linking actions to wrongdoing. Rebel's position, as you described it, is that she was acting as a whistleblower trying to call out behavior she believed was inappropriate or exploitative. From that perspective, speaking up would feel necessary, even risky. On the other side, the producers and others involved are arguing that these claims are false and damaging, which is why they've responded with defamation lawsuits. When both sides are making serious accusations and completely disagree on the facts, it creates a situation where credibility becomes everything. The leaked audio about a potential smear campaign complicates things even further. If people connected to Rebel's team discussed planting stories or creating anonymous platforms to push extreme allegations, that could seriously undermine her position. But again, even that depends on proof who was involved, what was actually done, and whether it can be directly tied back to her. Without that, it remains rather than established fact. Your point about risk is also key. Going after powerful figures, especially billionaires, is not something most people would do lightly. That's why observers tend to split into two camps. Either she genuinely believes what she's saying and is willing to take that risk, or she's made a massive miscalculation. There's not much middle ground when the stakes are this high. Her attempt to buy the rights to the film and move on is interesting too. It suggests, at least at one point, she may have wanted an exit rather than a prolonged fight. But by then, things had already escalated publicly and legally, making it much harder to contain. What makes this whole situation even more unpredictable is how public opinion is reacting. You'd expect certain audiences to rally behind someone making these kinds of claims, but that hasn't consistently happened. That could be due to the complexity of the case, the conflicting narratives, or skepticism created by the smear campaign allegations. At this stage, the simplest way to understand it is this. What started as a dispute over a film has evolved into a multi-front battle involving defamation claims, allegations of misconduct, questions about PR manipulation, and now a looming trial. And like the situation involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, everything ultimately comes down to what can actually be proven in court, not what sounds convincing online. Once the trial begins, the narrative will likely shift again, because instead of speculation, there will be structured arguments, evidence, and testimony. Until then, it's mostly competing stories and a lot of unanswered questions. What makes this situation so complicated and honestly a bit unsettling is exactly what you're getting at. The question of where the real power actually sits. On the surface, someone like Rebel Wilson looks powerful. She's famous. She's the director. She's the face of the project. But when you zoom out, you start to see another layer: people with significantly more financial power and influence behind the scenes. Like Amanda Ghosts and backers such as Len Blavatnik. In Hollywood, and honestly most industries, fame and power aren't always the same thing. Visibility doesn't necessarily equal control. That's why this whole situation feels so murky. It raises the possibility, without proving it, that narratives can be shaped early on by whoever has the resources to do so. If one side gets ahead in framing the story publicly, it can influence how everything else is interpreted afterward. But at the same time, that doesn't automatically mean the other side is right either. It just means the playing field isn't always even. You're also picking up on something important. This case doesn't fall neatly into the usual sides people expect. Unlike the situation involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, which some people frame through broader social narratives, this one is more about conflicting accounts between individuals in similar spaces. That makes it harder for the public to process, because there's no obvious lens to apply. It's just competing claims, both serious. The core issue really comes down to intent and evidence. If Rebel genuinely believed something inappropriate or exploitative was happening, then speaking up even at great personal cost fits the pattern of someone acting as a whistleblower. And as you said, that can come with huge consequences, legal fees, reputational damage, and the risk of losing everything tied to the project she spent years building. But on the flip side, if the claims, especially the most extreme ones, aren't backed by solid evidence, then it becomes a very different situation. Allegations at that level can't just be based on suspicion, industry rumors, or connections between powerful people. That's where the legal system draws a hard line. Your point about smear campaigns is also where things get especially tricky. Even if someone believes something is true, the way it's communicated matters. Anonymous sites, coordinated messaging, or exaggerated claims can undermine credibility, even if there's a legitimate concern underneath. So the question isn't just, is it true? It's also, how was this information handled and presented? And the human side of this shouldn't get lost either. As you mentioned, directors, especially first-time ones, often pour years into getting a film made. If something derails that at the final stage, emotions can run high and decisions can become more extreme. That doesn't automatically make someone right or wrong, but it does explain how situations escalate so quickly. Right now, you're basically where most people are, trying to make sense of incomplete information. It's reasonable to lean one way based on intuition, but also smart to keep that flexibility you mentioned, because cases like this can shift dramatically once more facts come out. At the end of the day, everything hinges on what can actually be demonstrated. If there's real evidence connecting the dots, that's one outcome. If there isn't, that's another. Until then, it's a mix of perception, strategy, and speculation, and that's why it feels so hard to pin down. Good morning, it's Friday, March 20th, 2026, and here's a more in-depth rundown for your commute as things in the entertainment world continue to move fast and change by the hour. Today's episode is entirely centered on the escalating legal drama involving Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, and Rebel Wilson. While these cases might seem separate at first glance, they're actually connected in some interesting ways: shared public relations teams, overlapping legal representation, and a broader pattern of high-stakes disputes that feel like classic David versus Goliath battles within the entertainment industry. These kinds of cases often reveal not just personal conflicts, but also how power, influence, and reputation are managed behind the scenes in Hollywood. At the center of the conversation right now is Blake Lively's case, which is at a critical turning point. A judge's ruling is expected soon, and there's growing speculation that the case could be dismissed altogether. That would mean the court finds there isn't enough substance for it to proceed to trial. On the other hand, it's also possible the judge allows certain claims to move forward while throwing others out. Either way, the decision will significantly shape how this situation unfolds, and it's something many people are watching closely. The timing has already been unpredictable. There was an expectation that a ruling might have come last week, so updates could drop at any moment. Later on, the focus shifts to Rebel Wilson's situation, which adds another layer to the overall story. Part of that includes a striking email from high-profile attorney Brian Friedman, a figure who seems to be involved in multiple major entertainment disputes. The message itself is intense and, depending on how you read it, could come across as aggressive or even intimidating. Though it's important to remember it exists within the context of legal negotiations. Still, it highlights how heated and complicated these behind-the-scenes exchanges can become. There's also renewed attention on a conversation involving Colleen Hoover and Blake Lively that's been circulating again. The exchange mixes lighthearted celebrity fangirling, especially over Taylor Swift, with moments that hint at deeper frustrations and tensions. It's a reminder of how even casual or playful interactions can carry undertones of real conflict, particularly when emotions are already running high. Overall, while some parts of these stories feel informal or even humorous on the surface, they collectively point to a much more complex and emotionally charged environment behind the scenes, one where personal feelings, professional stakes, and public perception are constantly colliding. Maybe it is a good line, honestly, Taylor. Feel free to use it in a song, blocked instead of clocked, or some version of that. Jokes aside, what we're really seeing now is how support for Blake Lively is being presented publicly and how that messaging lands. Take Paul Feig, for example. He spoke briefly at an Oscars party and, as expected, expressed support for Blake, describing her as doing great, staying strong, and focusing on her family. He highlighted that she's a great mother, that her kids are doing well, and that she has a happy marriage. On the surface, it's a standard supportive statement from a friend, but the emphasis on how happy everything is, especially the marriage, stands out in a slightly awkward way. Normally, when someone asks how you're doing, you don't jump straight to defending your relationship unless there's already speculation in the air. That's why some people interpret these kinds of comments as overly polished or even PR-driven. Whether that's fair or not, it creates this strange contrast. On one hand, everything is being framed as calm, stable, and positive. She's soldiering on, nothing to worry about, while on the other hand, there's clearly a major legal situation unfolding in the background. That tension is what makes people skeptical. Repeating that everything is great can sometimes have the opposite effect, making audiences question it more. And that brings us to the legal side, where things get even more uncertain. There's growing attention around commentary from legal analysts like Teresa Cant, who predicts that the judge could dismiss the case entirely. Her argument centers on whether there's enough concrete evidence for a jury to reasonably conclude that Justin Baldoni engaged in misconduct or retaliation. At the core of it, the judge isn't deciding who's morally right or wrong, they're deciding whether the legal threshold has been met. That means looking at whether there are sufficient facts, backed by evidence, to justify sending the case to trial. If the claims rely too heavily on assumptions, like missing messages or disappearing chats without direct proof, it becomes much harder to meet that standard. Otherwise, as critics point out, it would open the door for anyone to make serious accusations based on unverifiable gaps in communication. Another key issue being discussed is whether the situation meets the legal definition of workplace misconduct, specifically whether it was severe or ongoing enough to prevent someone from doing their job. According to some interpretations of the available documents, including Lively's own statements, that may be difficult to prove. There are claims that concerns were raised, addressed in a formal meeting, and that no further incidents occurred afterward. If that's accurate, it could weaken one of the necessary elements required for the case to proceed. So right now, everything is essentially on pause. Public statements continue, opinions are forming, and legal experts are making predictions, but ultimately, it all comes down to the judge's decision. Once that ruling drops, it will either validate one side's expectations or completely shift the narrative overnight. What's interesting here is how this whole situation highlights the gap between how legal cases actually work and how the public tries to interpret them. Most people, including us, aren't legal experts, so it's easy to fall into guessing games. Who's right, who's wrong, what feels true. But in reality, none of that matters unless it's backed by evidence that meets a very specific legal standard. That's why breakdowns from legal commentators are helpful. They shift the focus from opinion to what a court will actually consider. A big part of the discussion right now revolves around Blake Lively and her push for more involvement in the project, including a producer credit in the entertainment industry. That kind of credit can mean more than just a title. It often comes with influence, recognition, and sometimes financial benefits like residuals. It's also not unusual for major stars to receive executive producer credits, especially if they play a significant role in shaping the project. The complication here is that Lively reportedly backed up her request with documentation showing how involved she was. That could strengthen her position, but it also creates risk. If the case were to go to trial, those same claims could be closely examined and challenged, and that's where things get tricky. In everyday life, people might exaggerate their contributions a little, padding a resume, framing their role in the best possible light. But in a courtroom, those details matter a lot more. Walking back those claims later could damage credibility. So it puts someone in a difficult position. Stand by everything you said, or admit it was overstated. A possible argument, as some have speculated, is that her role evolved over time, that she became more involved later, even if certain issues happened earlier. But again, that depends entirely on how the timeline is established and interpreted. That timeline is actually one of the most critical pieces of the case involving Justin Baldoni. From a legal standpoint, claims like retaliation require a clear connection between two events, cause and effect. If there's a long gap between when a complaint was made and when alleged retaliation occurred, and especially if a lot happened in between, it becomes harder to prove that one directly led to the other. Courts tend to look for a strong logical link, not just a sequence of events. Because of that, there's a real possibility the judge could decide the case